Oh yeah, now they're coming in.
Okay, all right.
We're up to 12, 13.
Yeah, I'm used to seeing everybody.
Yeah. Are we or should we record?
I think we are.
Okay, because that way anybody who gave up, we
No,
could always.
We are. Welcome everybody as you're coming in. We're just kind of waiting for the system to catch up to let people in. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, but looks like we're all here. So just hold on a minute. Eric, Harry, do you guys want to mute yourselves for now? Ken? All right, let's get started here. So, hello and welcome everybody to the Reshoring and Rebuilding Supply Chain Train the Trainer webinar. My name is Michael Lobsinger, and I'm the Senior Vice President of the Center for Economic Growth, the Regional Economic Development Organization for the Capital Region, and the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Center for the Capital Region. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping things. You'll notice you have a toolbar along the bottom of your screen. You can use this to send questions to panelists at any point during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A icon. We'll address those questions at the end of the workshop. After the workshop is completed, we will send a link to share the materials referred to in the workshop and a copy of the video recording of this webinar. So today's event is being brought to you by the Manufacturing Reimagined series, a New York Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. As part of a mission to support New York's many small and medium-sized manufacturers. Manufacturing Reimagined series will offer further workshops in addition to one-on-one discussions for customized resource report and potential funding opportunities for the manufacturing clients and for our MEP and NYSTAR partners. Before I hand it actually over to Eric Fasser from FuseHub and Harry Mosier from Reshoring Initiative, I'm going to give a quick view of the New York MEP Reshoring and Supply Chain Program. So I'll quickly go through that before I hand it over. The National Institute of Technology and Standards, NIST, through the Federal CARES Program, included $50 million to support small and medium-sized businesses impacted by COVID-19. New York was awarded a portion of these funds to support various programs, including a reshoring and supply chain program of up to $800,000 in funding. And CEG is the lead on that program. And about half of these funds will actually go towards what we're going to call assessments and projects. Really, the goal of the program here is to look at criteria of what types of manufacturers are good targets for reshoring and supply chain, establishing tools and the resources needed to help do assessments, and that's what we're going to talk about today, as well as surveying companies to gather information about the impacts. And these things are kind of happening concurrently. What we're going to talk about today and the tools that we've identified are things like import substitution program, total cost of ownership, looking at alternative materials and process substitutions, and supply chain gap and risk analysis. These are all different tools that we can use to help assess, where a company stands and where their opportunities are at, and then follow on hopefully with projects to assist them. these tools will be there, made available for everybody to access and work with the MEPs to utilize them. So regarding projects, so if there are projects that can be done here, and assessments done, you would engage with your regional MEP. This is so we can capture metrics on these projects and these assessments. Projects can range from anything from lean to ISO to new product development, new market development, supply chain, obviously, but they do need to be tied in some instance to COVID-19 impacts and things that the manufacturer is doing to either mitigate those impacts or pivot because of those impacts. These projects can also leverage other grants like WDI and our utility programs as well. So other things that we're doing within this program is obviously aggregating the data so we can kind of look at best practices and draw some conclusions about that. There is a survey that's out there that's on, I think, one of the next slides. We're going to share this information, the results of that, as well as the tools or roadmap on using supply chain gaps and reshoring initiatives that companies may be taking. And then also we're going to be launching some things on developing tools to further advance adoption of automation and robotics as part of this. So this in summary, in the current phase, we're reaching out to manufacturers across the state for feedback through a survey. That survey can be found on the link that's shown on the screen. So I really would like to urge both our manufacturers, but also our partners here that are working with them to visit this link. And the call to action is to promote it for them to fill it out, or actually just work with them directly and give them a call and fill it out together. The importance of the survey is in order to actually qualify to have an assessment done or to have a project done, we need you to fill out the survey, so that is going to be a requirement. Assessments will pretty much be free through the MEP, and the projects that we identify, there could be grants up to $10,000 for those projects. There is a limited number of projects that can be funded through this, so the money's probably going to go pretty fast initially. Right now, we're still waiting for a contract to be signed by the state so we can get that money out there, but we are moving forward to identify companies that we can do projects with. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Eric, I believe. So Eric's going to talk about supply chain risks and vendor. I always forget your vendor. Eric, you'll remember.
Yep. Whoops.
Vendor audit.
All right. Screen is good. Yep. Okay. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be running through a couple of supply chain tools. These are worksheets that all of you attending will be able to use to help manufacturers strengthen their supply chain. Specifically, we've got a supplier audit worksheet, which is something that after reaching out to a vendor or supplier, this is a way of tracking results, tracking quotes, tracking their capabilities, things like that. We're going to go through that in detail. And then the other one is a risk assessment worksheet, which we'll also go through in detail. So kind of an eye chart here, but this is a screenshot of the Excel file you'll get. We did it in Excel because we want people to customize it. So I'm just going to kind of walk through the sections just so we can kind of see what we're dealing with in general. As Michael mentioned, there'll be a link sent afterwards that'll have both Excel files in it, as well as a copy of this presentation, so you can kind of walk through it with your manufacturers and help them kind of walk through the process. So, obviously there's a section for reviewer and review date. And, the only thing I would say about that is for consistency, if you have the same reviewer doing these across multiple suppliers, it'll help keep the results consistent. There's a section obviously for the supplier information, who's the contact, where they located, things like that. The bulk of it is, across the top rows here. There's a rating system, there's criteria, which you will establish with them based on their products, assign a rating and make comments. And the bulk of it, the really part that you're going to customize is the criteria and the measures themselves. And I'm going to go through this part in detail and kind of give you some ideas on what things to look for each of the sections, and some brainstorming activities you can use with your manufacturers to get them thinking about what's really important for their business and what should they really be tracking in these audit worksheets. So I want to take a quick step back, and a lot of these people say, well, why should I bother auditing? I'm going to reach out to somebody, they're going to give me a price, and the lowest price is the one I'm going to buy from. And that's absolutely not what you want to do. Harry's going to go into a lot of detail about why, but briefly, the audit is a way to gather data and track that data across multiple suppliers and use that to make better decisions. It's a way to kind of standardize what you're using and use uniform criteria when making these decisions. It's a strategic approach. Like I mentioned, you're not just looking at the price, you're looking at all these other factors that can affect your supply chain and in turn have costs and risks of their own. So ultimately, you want to find the best fit between a supplier's capabilities and what the manufacturer's needs are. And these, the manufacturer should be using this worksheet to identify the best alignment between their supply chain through all the suppliers in their supply chain and what is their growth plan. So really be thinking strategic, be thinking long-term, and use these worksheets to their maximum potential. So from the manufacturer's perspective, some best practices would be, again, think strategically when approaching a supplier. Do research up front. Don't just call the first person on the list and say, hey, what can you do for me? You want to encourage these people to really be prepared to approach you, especially startups. Be prepared to approach these suppliers. They need to be honest about where they are in their product development. They need to have, especially if they're a little more advanced, they ought to have drawings, CAD files, spec sheets. All of these things will help them have a better dialogue with the vendor. And to that next point, really, they want to establish more of a partnership. It's not just you're selling me a product and that's the end of it. You want to create a win-win value proposition. Emphasize that if the company does well, their suppliers are going to do well. So there's future growth potential there as well. And to the point of this exercise is have this scoring matrix so you can evaluate suppliers on the criteria that's important to you, and also evaluate suppliers against each other. So if you need to make a switch, you have data to back that up. From your perspective, the people watching this webinar, some of the best practices would be just understand where these manufacturers are getting their list of potential suppliers. There's online sources like ThomasNet and Global Spec where they can just type in a search and get some information. Not so much these days, but usually trade shows and expos are a good source of potential vendors, because you can actually meet them face to face and talk to them. There's economic development agencies, chambers of commerce, etc., and of course the MEP network and Fuse Hub. So each of those is going to have a little idiosyncrasies on how much information they have up front and how they're positioned to go and start these conversations. So just understand where they're coming from in that regard, and that will help kind of directing them on how to use these tools to the maximum effect. And just one other thing is, encourage them to seek redundant sources. You don't want to just get one vendor, especially if it's a specialized part. One and done is not the way to go. You want to have backups. I think everyone that's been doing business these last several months has realized that if you only have one source of supply, those companies really are not doing well now. So it's the companies that have planned ahead, have multiple sources, even if it's a little more expensive. We're seeing many companies that had overseas supply. They had domestic as a backup, but weren't necessarily using it because they thought the cost was prohibitive. But by having that backup in place, when everything overseas shut down, they were still able to continue business and keep their company going. So something to keep in mind there. So going back to that first slide, or that previous slide that said, here's the area you want to customize. the question there is, well, what do I want to audit? And that comes down to each manufacturer asking themselves, well, what criteria is most important in reaching my goal? And the goal is to stay in business, have a robust supply chain. So examples on the Excel file that you're going to get are performance, quality, delivery, and price. Those are kind of the four big ones. Most of the important criteria will fall under those headings, but obviously it's something that can be customized and something we want them to customize. So I'll just go through a few examples for each of those. So for performance, you want to look at, or your manufacturers want to look at, what is the technical capability of the vendor? Are they an expert in their field? Are they familiar with the industry regulations and standards, and keeping on top of them so they can anticipate changes and be ready for those? Do they work with other companies that are in the same markets, and so they have a feel for market trends and how things are shifting? Do they have the appropriate assets in place? Is their equipment in good order? Are they ready to scale up with you? So that's where it becomes important for the manufacturer to share what their growth plans are, share some forecasts and potential projections, because that can really help weed out companies that would give you a good price initially, but then just can't keep up when your business takes off. So, and then technical assistance. The better suppliers are going to have teams in-house that are doing research and engineering and can help with part revisions and material testing and quality assurance and things like that. So with this, understanding what we mean by performance and these three subheadings, a manufacturer should really be able to dig down and identify, okay, for our business, for our product, these are the things that we really need to keep track of when we're talking to new suppliers. The next one is quality. This is an obvious one, but maybe you need to use somebody who has a certification like ISO certification. So that's something you want to track on the worksheet. Make sure there's a box for it so you can check it off and make sure everyone you're talking to has that designation. Quality tracking would be things like internal processes, standard operating procedures. Are they doing 100% part inspection? Do they do a good job of revision control? So if you tweak your part and change the rev number on it, are they going to follow that? Or are you going to start getting product that is considered old, and maybe it's a change that isn't obvious? So when incoming goods to the manufacturer, they don't notice it right away. Well, that creates a lot of problems downstream. So that's something you want to take care of early on. So that could be a really important thing to track as you're auditing these potential suppliers. And order accuracy and verification before it leaves the supplier. Does it get checked one last time to make sure the order is complete and there aren't any errors with it? Quality concerns like, do they have testing facilities in-house? Are they doing part tracing, things like that? And then scrap rates. Again, this is something you would want to have your manufacturers determine ahead of time with the supplier. There's going to be defects, but what's an acceptable amount? How do those get handled? Is there rework involved? Is there credit? So just, it's a discussion that needs to be had ahead of time and determine how that's all going to be resolved in the end. The next one is delivery, so lead time and responsiveness and things like that. Just understanding not only how quickly they're going to get product to you. So it may come down to where they're located. For example, if you're working with somebody in New York, closer proximity is going to typically have a better lead time than something coming out of state or even overseas. So understanding how frequent shipments are going to be made, lot sizes, things like that. And to the first point, the responsiveness is, especially in where we are now in the market with COVID and things are changing weekly and daily. How responsive are they? If you say, hey, I've got a sudden opportunity to ship 1,000 more units, I need parts for it. what is their response going to be to that? Are they going to, number one, do they get back to you right away when you ask a question like that? And then can they handle a request like that? Do they have a certain amount of safety stock in-house where they can respond quickly? So again, just things to consider, to kind of talk through with them, make sure they're your manufacturers are aware of these types of issues that can come up, and if they are important to them, make sure they're capturing them. So last area is price, and we look at price quality, and I'll get to that in a second. So that would be, when they get a quote, how accurate is the quote? Is it thorough? Does it include the proper components? Does it have things like labeling and documentation that normally would be overlooked? Are the pack quantities correct? Or if you didn't ask for a specific pack quantity, have they made recommendations that make sense? Have you had that dialogue to understand, if we're going to buy 10 at a time or 1,000 at a time? So it gets back to the manufacturer's processes, how much volume they're doing, but just make sure these conversations are taking place. Price flexibility. So is the quote locked in for a certain period of time? Mostly they are, but is that period of time acceptable, and is it does it seem like a good compromise? And then is it based on a raw material? So in that example, if you're seeing, let's say you're buying, you're doing injection molded parts, and resin is based on oil prices. So if the oil prices are skyrocketing, you can expect the material cost to go up. So make sure they understand how that's tied together, and for in a different example, it may be some other raw material that's more obscure, and you don't want to be surprised by, oh well, the market did this, so we have to change our pricing all of a sudden. It's something you don't want to get caught by surprise. So it's worth capturing that data ahead of time. And then the last part would be, rewards and penalties based on payment terms, based on incentives for on-time and accurate delivery. Are there volume discounts, and how are defects and warranty items handled? So back to my first point about price quality. Again, price obviously is going to be an important part of the quote, but we don't want to look at just the cost of goods sold. And Harry's going to go into this in a lot more detail, but we really want to look at the total cost of ownership and the total cost of the product. So I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'll let him do that later. And then the last part of here is the kind of the other category. So again, things that may not apply to everyone, but you definitely want to be aware of IP protection. If you have like a trade secret where it's not necessarily patented and protected by a patent, at least make sure you get a non-disclosure agreement, and make sure you record that has taken place. If you're dealing with any kind of Department of Defense supplier or contractor, definitely there's going to be cybersecurity issues that may have certain certificates and protections that need to take place. Ownership of tooling, for example, going back to the injection molding example, who owns the tooling? That we would always recommend that the customer, the manufacturer, owns the tooling, not the supplier, because then it makes it easier if they need to switch suppliers. And if a new process is developed in a supplier making a part for someone, who owns that? Who owns the rights to that IP? So things to think about. For larger companies, vendor managed inventory might be something worth looking at, and holding a certain safety stock. And then definitely, if possible, I know it's tough these days, but if possible, you want to do an in-person audit of the supplier's facility. This lets you not only validate the equipment and the processes that they say they can do. Zoom is good, phone call is good, getting a nice quote is good, but when you actually can see things in person, make general observations about how clean is the facility? Is it organized? Or does the equipment look like it's in good working order? Have they identified places for incoming goods, inventory, work in process, finished goods? Those kind of things will really help you get a better idea for how legitimate are they? How likely do I feel that they're going to be able to maintain shipments on time, not have any surprises? And that kind of gets into the risk assessment we're going to talk about next. So tips for the worksheet. Again, look for multiple source options for each part and component. Definitely customize the worksheets for suppliers, but you may also want to customize them by part or sub-assembly. So for example, if you're getting multiple parts from one supplier, but there's one of them that's maybe a little bit special, and you're thinking of getting a second supplier, that break that out from the first one so you can do an apples to apples comparison just for that part among the different vendors. The scale that's on there is a 0 to 5 scale by default, but that's not written in stone. Change it if it's easier. 10-point scale, 100-point scale, or even for some items might just be a simple yes and no. And remember, all you're really looking to do is compare one to another. So if one has the ISO certification and one doesn't, but it's not crucial, then at least it's something you can keep track of and be aware of when making your decisions. And then the last thing I would say is, just make sure you update it regularly. Don't just do it one time and leave it. Suppliers change, so you should keep your sheets updated. That way, when you're looking at a new supplier, you can do an accurate and up-to-date comparison between the two. So the next one is the risk assessment tool. Again, kind of an eye chart, but we're going to go through each of these sections. So the section on the left is, again, probably the most critical part. This is the risk description. So these are the different parts, the different activities that may have risk associated with them. Risk type is where you kind of quantify what type of risk it is it internal, external? You do an evaluation of the severity and likelihood. And then lastly, there's room to put in some sort of a mitigation plan and contingency plan. So again, this part, the first 4 columns here is what we want to focus on for the manufacturer to be able to customize that to their procedures. So risk description. So let me go back here for a second. So you see we have, part 1, 2, 3, 4 listed out, then packaging, things like that. Really, we want to focus on the critical parts. You don't want to list every component that's in the bill of material. Critical parts and critical factors and activities that have the most risk for your operations. So examples, again, would be the components, equipment. If you have older equipment that might fail, that might be a risk you want to consider. But then there's even non-tangible things like working capital, regulations. If a regulation changes, what does that do to your business? That could be a big risk. And things all the way down the line through distribution. So I'm going to have a sheet later on that just has some kind of general areas to get the brainstorming started. And the other thing I would say is look for synergies between the audit worksheet and the risk assessment worksheet. The manufacturer, if they've done the audit worksheet, they've already identified which areas and which criteria are the most important. So if they want to focus on those first and assign risk to those that's inherent to those, it'll help kind of get them started on that process. So here's just some general categories, with like 7 or 8 categories with some examples. So obviously, in the environmental, there's natural disasters, a pandemic. How does that affect your business, your supply chain? So I'm not going to read through all these, but just have this as a reference point to have that discussion with manufacturers and kind of walk through these with them so they can kind of understand what the thought process should be in assigning the various risk categories. And I would just say avoid these common mistakes. So one mistake would be not paying attention to policy and regulations. Even if you're only dealing with New York State vendors, you still want to be aware of international policies, tariffs, things like that, because your suppliers may be located in New York, but their raw materials may be coming from out of state or out of the country. So, the more information you have, the better you can be prepared to avoid any risk associated with that. Another mistake is ignoring the trade-off between a super specialized part and the number of vendors available. And what I mean by that is, on the flip side, if you're using all commodity components in your product, you can get those anywhere. They're relatively cheap, but there's a lot of extra cost in assembly typically, and labor to put those together. So a lot of times people will specialize, create custom components that can replace 10 or 15 other components. But the more specialized you get, the harder it can be to find a vendor. So just be aware of that trade-off. Another mistake is relying on a single supplier, like I mentioned before, not having a backup in case something goes down. Another mistake is allowing a supplier to own the tooling for your product, like I mentioned. If something happens, if there's a falling out or price increases dramatically, and you want to switch to another vendor, if you don't own that tooling, now you're looking at potentially 10, 12 weeks or even longer to have new tooling made, depending on, again, the complexity of the part, the size of the part, things like that. Avoid having poor documentation, revision control. This is something that can definitely come back to bite the manufacturers if they make a revision to a part that's not obvious. Maybe it's a dimensional tolerance that was tweaked because there were failures in the field or something like that. It doesn't get caught leaving the supplier because they don't check the revisions. It didn't get caught on incoming goods inspection because it's not obvious. It only gets caught months later when it's out in the field and products are failing. So definitely want to make sure you emphasize that to the manufacturers. And then the last thing is, don't try and bleed the supplier of margin. You want to work with them. You want to create a partnership. Again, it's a win-win that you want to establish a good relationship and a good long-term relationship. So just in summary, to get the most out of these worksheets, emphasize that you need to put in the time, customize them properly, be consistent about it, and remember that there is some tandem, some synergies between the two. So best do it all, do both worksheets and really stay on top of them, and they really will help manage the supply chain and ensure that it's going to be useful for them and translate into savings and less risk. And then the goal of these worksheets is to help these manufacturers select the best suppliers based on all the important factors, not just the purchase price, but everything else that's going into it, and really limit the negative impact on their businesses by identifying the risks and having them create mitigation plans for that. So with that, again, there's my follow-up information for any questions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Harry. So thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Eric, can you nod? Good. That's good. And I hope you can see me. It's good to be back in New York. I grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, right across the river from New York City. So I've got some connections there. And I lived and worked in Schenectady for a year, working for GE's large steam turbine generator. That was about 50 years ago. And I enjoyed it very much. And I was happy to be a New York resident then. So I've got a series of things I'm going to present to you. And Kim has it on her computer. We're going to work our way down. And Kim, I noticed one thing we don't have is there's an Excel file that I sent called typical example of something or other. And we're going to need that one eventually as we come down. If you don't have it, then I'll have to pull it up. So in front of you, I've got like my mini agenda for the topics I'm going to cover. And I'm going to start off with a brief PowerPoint about reshoring in general, so you can see it's happening. So you can see the strong trend, because it's hard. 10 years ago, nobody believed it would happen, and it's happened very well. And to help convince people to try it, it's important that you understand that it's really happening and that it therefore more can happen. We're going to go through a PowerPoint that covers that, talking about ISP. You can see that on the screen, the import substitution program. So substituting domestic production for imports, that's reshoring. Producing here instead of there, supplying the US market with product from the US. And I'm going to work my way down through a series of topics related to that, and then talk a little bit about the supply chain gaps program and the difference between the two. The import substitution program is to help companies, typically SMEs, the kind of MEP clients, to help those companies find new customers for what they now make. Like they're really good at making widgets. Okay, here's some more people that are importing widgets, and you can sell to them. So that's new business of what you now make. Whereas supply chain gaps is to find categories of products that nobody's making in the US, but there's a lot being imported, and therefore these companies or foreign companies, foreign direct investment, can proceed to fill that gap domestically and become, at least initially, the only US supplier or the primary US supplier in that category. So think masks and gowns and gloves and all these things that we've seen having problems. I'm then going to talk about TCO, total cost of ownership. Eric referred to that a couple of times, and then by that time we'll be done. So Kim, can you page down? Okay, so you can take you through a PowerPoint. This obviously is tied into COVID and the problems and the impact that's had on reshoring. Next. So to show you the trend in reshoring, I've plotted here the number of jobs reshored each year, either reshored by US companies, think General Motors or GE, or FDI, foreign direct investment, by foreign companies, Siemens, Toyota, somebody like that. And so in 2010, when we were founded, the sum of those two trends, those two actions in that year was 6,000 jobs. In 2017, it was 190,000 jobs. So in that year, so up 30 times in an annual rate, and driven then significantly by the corporate tax reductions and the regulatory reductions. And then it fell off in 2018 and 2019, probably because of the trade wars. The companies had business uncertainty. They didn't know what tariffs were going to apply to what products from what countries for how long. And they said, hell, let's just wait and see what happens. And when this all settles out, we'll decide what to do. So things fell off in 2018, 2019, still at good levels, but not as high as 2017. And then in 2020, the FDI so far has continued down and the reshoring has picked up. And a significant amount of the pickup has been COVID or pandemic related. So the about 60%, that's 60% of the cases of reshoring since March have mentioned the pandemic as one of the reasons that they shifted the work back. So that's happened. We talked about TCO, total cost of ownership. And you can see here, it is a tool that we have online, and I'm going to take you to it later, but it's online on our website. It's free to use. All you have to do is go there and sign up and sign in and use it. And it's used to make that calculation that Eric was referring to understand all the costs, all the risks, and to quantify those so that the company makes a better decision. So this is intended for use by the OEM, the bigger company, the one that offshores or doesn't or sources domestically, for them to make better sourcing decisions, but also for the SME to use as a sales tool to convince that OEM to make a better sourcing decision, bring the work back, and either produce it in-house or buy from the SME. So in this case, the Chinese price was 70, the US price was 100, so the red and blue. And so pretty easy decision for the procurement person to say, hell, that's 30% difference. I'm going to buy 12,000 of those a year. That's $360,000 a year of savings. Of course, we'll send it off to China and have it made, or India or somewhere. But when they did total cost, the total cost for China was now 98, US 108. Now there's a 10% difference. And assuming that the Chinese wage rates keep going up as they have, in 2 or 3 years, the Chinese total cost would be higher than the US. So hopefully, if we can get them to look at this, the company will say, looks like we should not send the new work off, because sort of like Eric was saying, it'll be over there. You'll have to bring the tooling back, all this work, to when the Chinese costs have gone higher than the US. So why don't we not send the new product off and let's start strategically planning to bring what's over there back and expand our own factory, the OEM, or find local suppliers, train workers, buy equipment, do whatever, so that we can meet that demand in the future. So this is the key tool for getting, again, the big companies to make the right decision and the small companies to help them make the right decision. Next. So to show you the power of this, this chart shows the data from 180 companies who came in and used our TCO estimator online and said they were doing a real case. And so the blue chart shows the price, and specifically the Chinese price as a percentage of the US price. So at 100%, they're equal. At the peak of the blue curve, around 70, the Chinese price is 70% of the US price. So substantially lower, enough that you can see why companies buy there. And you can see the 8% written there is the percentage of the cases where the Chinese price was higher than the US. So 8% of the cases, you might say the US wins based on price. The red curve is exactly the same cases, but for total cost of ownership, where the TCO estimator has helped the user include the duty and the freight and the carrying cost of inventory, the intellectual property risk, travel costs, all the risk of stocking out, like companies did during the panic. And so so that goes from 8% to 32%. So much higher percentage now that is profitably sourced here or produced here. And then if there happened to be a Trump 15% tariff, that goes up further to 46%. So the whole purpose of this is to show that in an earlier slide, I showed that companies are bringing work back. And this shows one of the reasons why, because the companies increasingly are doing the math correctly and seeing that it does make sense. We'd say in 20 or 30% of the cases to bring the work back. The challenge when you work with the companies is to pick the work that is most likely to come up into that right of the 100% line where it's more profitable to bring it back. Next. And so the tools and programs that we offer to you that we'll be offering through the MEP system is first the TCO estimator. We've talked about that briefly. It's free online, and there's a free training webinar, a 1-hour webinar that takes you through the details. I won't have time to do it today, and you probably wouldn't sit for if we extended this to 2.5 hours. But it's available. It's free online. It's linked from this. You go ahead and use it. Then second, SBS. So citing, S-I-T-I-N-G, and buying smarter. This is to help the OEMs make better decisions and decide to reshore either in-house or outsource to local suppliers within the state. Import substitution program is to help the suppliers convince the OEMs to do that so that the OEMs will then buy from them. And supply chain gaps, again, is to identify big categories of work, or let's say categories of work that are almost all imported, and therefore there's an opportunity for either FDI by foreign companies or by local companies to fill those gaps. So if I'd been really smart a year ago, I'd have talked about masks and gowns and gloves and pharmaceuticals and pointed out that all these things were too dependent on offshore and somebody should be doing it, and will do it here profitably. Next. So to make this visual, the orangish facility there in New England is an OEM, and they're bringing in components from all around the world. And there's another OEM out in California, maybe bringing in components from around the world. Next. That's the way things are now. And the idea with citing and buying smarter is that OEM, this happens to be Rhode Island, that OEM decides to make more in-house instead of buying stuff from offshore. And they decide to buy more from the local suppliers within the state. So that's the citing and buying smarter program, working with the OEMs. Next. And then the import substitution program takes a supplier or multiple suppliers within the state and helps them find other OEMs around the country, in the state or around the country, who are importing what that supplier makes well. So we identify for them who those importers are, train the supplier to use total cost to go out and convince those OEMs to buy from them instead of continuing to import. Next. And then the supply chain gaps program, we identify these big gaps. Again, think masks and gowns and gloves, but all kinds of other metal things and so on. And then we either get local companies or in some ways more likely foreign companies, the current foreign suppliers that are shipping into the US, and convince them to come into your state and put in a facility and supply those gaps from within the United States. This is especially attractive now because there's pretty good federal money available with loans and to make these things happen, to fill these supply chain gaps and make the US once again self-sufficient. Next. So to give a little more detail on the program that the MEP is most likely to pursue is the import substitution program. So what happens there, a company identifies a product, call it a widget, a thing, something that they make and something they're really rather good at making. Not just they can make anything, but something they're good at making. And then we tell them who the companies, who the importers are, the name of the company, their address, so they can contact them, the actual product that they're bringing in, the number of tons per year they're bringing in, some idea of what they're paying for them, so they get a feeling for whether they can be reasonably competitive, and who the offshore suppliers are. And then we train that the SME company, the local company that your client, the MEP client, to use total cost to do the calculation of all those extra costs. So when they go to the OEM, they can make the case to the OEM that the OEM will be more profitable buying from them rather than continuing to buy from somewhere in Asia or Europe or somewhere else. Next. So to put this in perspective, we're currently working with the MEPs that I showed there. Illinois is the most advanced. They've been doing this for 3 or 4 months. But the other ones, including New York State, we're honored to be working with you and talking to a bunch of other MEPs about proceeding with this. In the state of Rhode Island, we work with both the MEP called Polaris and also the state commerce department, and they split up the work between the two of them that way. We think by the end of the year, we'll be working with maybe 50 companies and maybe 100 products, most of them in that SME supplier category. Next. Okay, and this shows for each category of company, like large OEMs, the obvious thing to work with them is this citing and buying smarter, where there's the 2 checks. For the SMEs, both contract manufacturers and smaller branded product companies, then ISP is the obvious thing. And for foreign direct investment, the supply chain gaps. But everything could work with each of the groups. Next, I think that's it. Okay. Okay. So the next slide coming down, I'd like you to actually, Kim, jump further down to something a couple pages down. I want to go to. No, further down. So further. Let me see there. Yes, this is good. So I don't know if everybody can read that or not. It isn't necessary that you read it, but what we provide here is a list of criteria to target companies for the ISP program, because that's what most of you are probably going to work with. And that's where the companies get the most excited about this. And so if you started off, we start with number of employees. I say 25 or more, and that's because if you come into a 3-man machine shop and you say we're going to help you compete with China and get a $5 million order, well, they can't handle a $5 million order, and they're probably not specialized enough to be competitive enough to take the business. So generally bigger. If they have 10 people and they're all making the same thing, then maybe that's okay. But generally more like 25 or more. Breadth of product, I say narrow, but but at least focused. You know, they might like a lot of things, but maybe half their capacity is in one category of things, shafts or flanges or automotive wire harnesses or something rather specialized, competitive. If they're going to compete and convince the OEM to bring the work back, the company has to be competitive. They have to be automated. They have to be creative. They have to be aggressive to make this happen. I mentioned automated. They have to have some available capacity, or at least be willing to put in more capacity. Because if they're already overloaded, they're probably not going to be as interested. So a range of things like that. Then down in the second group there, I said, what are the characteristics of the products? And generally products where there's a lot of imports, because you can't reshore it if it isn't now being imported, either automated or automatable to offset the higher US labor costs. Not too labor intense, really saying the same thing. If it's too labor intense, then it's probably going to be awfully tough to bring it back. Subject to Trump tariffs. The tariffs, most of them on China are 25%. So if a lot of the products coming in from China and is subject to the 25% tariff, and again, that's maybe half of the imports from China, then that says this could be a gold mine. President-elect Biden a couple of days ago announced that he was not going to remove those tariffs anytime soon for various reasons. And so utilizing the tariffs as part of this action, I think makes an awful lot of sense. And a series of other topics. I'm not going to go through them all, but you all have received these. Michael sent them all to you. So I urge you to look at them, and it's the list is not meant to be, is not so much meant to exclude companies as to prioritize companies. So if a company doesn't, no companies can have all the characteristics that I listed there, but the idea is to have some of the, especially the ones that are higher up on each list, some of those characteristics, and the ones that have more of the characteristics that are high on the list, and those are the ones to start with, and they'll be most likely to succeed with the program. Okay, Kim, can we go back up to procedures? Okay, go past that to procedures. Okay, so this, I'm not going to go through this again in detail, but this is like a standard operating procedure. It says who does what to whom. We train you. You go out and find these companies. They fill out the input form. You make sure it's reasonably accurate. You get it to us. If it isn't accurate enough, we ask you to work on it again. Once it's accurate, we provide a deliverable database, which a file that lists the biggest importers of the products that the company would like to compete for, and with all the data that I described in that slide about the ISP program. So it's just says whose responsibility is at each phase to do that. Yeah, it's the kind of thing you read once, and it's a place to go back to as we proceed. But it's just to let you see what the basic deal is. Kim, can you get to the input forms link on our website? Okay, so this is the on the import substitution program page of our website is a form, and this is an example form, because as you see down towards the bottom of it, it's filled out, but as hypothetical makeup kind of things. And but go back up to, yeah, towards the top. So the company that you're dealing with, the SME, puts in, like on any, like I think on Eric's form, who's the company, where are they located, who's submitting it, etc. You know, very just standard. Who are you? And then they answer in what geographic region of the U.S. do they think they would be competitive. Now, some things, if they're light and high value, it makes sense to compete all over the country. you can air freight. It doesn't cost much to get it there because it's light, it's high value, etc. Other things like, 20-ton steel fabrications, probably they only are competitive within 100 miles or something, because the expense and the cost of shipping that kind of a product across a great distance, going on highways and tearing down bridges and things like that to get through. So most people are going to say the whole US, but some might say, realistically, I'm only competitive in New York or in the middle Atlantic states or something like that. Okay, so something to think about. Drop down a little bit, and we talk about the products. And you can see in the left-hand column, column A, they're ranked 1, 2, 3, 4. So the idea is for the company, this client, to pick, think about the things that they make well. And again, it could be a contract manufacturer that says they make everything, but it's got to be something that they've had their best success at, where they're most competitive, what they've tooled up the best, they have the best record with. Pick the ones like that. Or if it's a branded product company, but they're a smaller maker of pumps and fans, whatever, pretty clear what they're good at making. So rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And then the column B is the HS code that describes that product. Now, some of you know what HS codes are. Most of you know what NAICS or SIC codes are. So for perspective, NAICS and SIC codes describe an industry, think foundry, whereas HS codes describe products. For example, gray iron engine block casting, which happens to be made in a foundry, but it isn't a foundry. So the HS codes are used by all the countries of the world to have a consistent method to define imports and exports, because that definition is what determines the duty rate when the product comes into a country. And this keeps them from arguing about that. So there's very clear definitions for this, and we've included there a link in column B to get to the page where you can look up the HS code and find out what it is. You put in a word that describes the product. It tells you roughly what the HS code is. Now, the companies we're talking about, if they've ever exported these products, even to Canada or Mexico, they had to ascribe an HS code to it. So this isn't mystery, this isn't rocket science. This is find it in the files if you've ever exported, or look at that at that link and you can find it. The next code is, the next column, C, is the official HS code description. So on those pages, when you look it up, there'll be anywhere from a 10 to a 30-word description of what that HS code covers. And bam, you put it in there as a reference. And then column D is other words that are used to describe it. So for example, the HS code might say, the official description might say fastener, but this company knows what they really make are nuts and bolts and screws. So at this point, you'd put nuts and bolts and screws into column D. Column E says, what are some big US companies that use these products that you'd love to sell to and that you think might be importing them? So you put in the names of those companies, and then in the next column, their address. And the reason we ask the address is if you just say General Motors, GM has, 100 plants around the country, and we're going to look at what's being shipped to the actual address that you give us. So we need the company name and the address, and then who are the biggest offshore competitors. Now, some companies won't know this, and others, the bigger, more sophisticated, more specialized companies will know. So it's nice to be able to get these. If they cannot identify the big offshore competitors, then do the best you can. So what we do then, we take all this data, the HS code, the descriptions, the likely US customers, doesn't have to be all of them, but at least a couple as an example, the foreign suppliers, if we can find them. And then we go in the database and we put all that data in, and we filter the data of all the US bills of lading, all the shipments coming into the US by ocean, and we come up with the importers that are importing the most of the product that this company you're dealing with, your client company, wants to sell more of. And so that's product one. Everything that relates to product one, you can see in the gray area. So all those different rows under product one all relate to that one category of product. And then once you're done with product one, you go on to product two and you do the same kind of thing. Okay, so this is the example form, and on our website under resources and then import substitution program, there's a link to the blank form. So it's got the blank form and it's got the example form. When you're actually having a company fill it out, they obviously use the blank form, but it's good to show them the example form because that'll help them to understand what's expected of them. Okay, Kim, how about suggestions for filling out the form? It's one of the pages on your file. So I think maybe back up a little bit. Let's see. No, looks like it's further down. Okay, suggestions for filling out input forms. Again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but from working with IMEC, which is the Illinois MEP, which you might think of as the scouts, because they went through this first, and they made errors inevitably because they had never done this before, and then we resolved it together, and I've given details here on how to fill out each of the columns, so when you're working with a client company and helping them do this, if you go back, read this before you see them, share this with them, that's fine, and you'll be much more likely to get it right the first time. So just as an example of this kind of thing, they had a company that produced some kind of a product to be used in hospitals, and under the who are the biggest importers, they put the word hospitals. And obviously there's what, 10,000 hospitals in the United States. And so just having the word hospitals doesn't get me to any specific hospital. And even if I had the name of the Cleveland Clinic or something like that, or whatever the New York equivalent is, that hospital probably doesn't import. They probably buy from a company or a distributor or somebody else. And I'm trying to find the importer, not the customer for the product. So the idea is to get to the level in the supply chain as best you can of the company that actually is probably doing the importing, because that's the one that I'm going to look up in the file and use that to triangulate to find what's actually coming in. Okay? And again, the reason we ask them for all this information, sometimes just knowing the HS code, just knowing the product isn't enough, because you wind up with maybe 5,000 shipments or something, and yet there's only 100 of those or 200 that are relevant to this customer. So by knowing the likely importer and by knowing some of the foreign suppliers, it might turn out that they're using a different word to describe it. And so we look at the connections between the importer and the foreign supplier, and where maybe like I think Eric talked about molds. We call it MOLD, and the British call it MOULD. So in their description, if we search on mold, MOLD, we don't find the MOULDs. So by finding some of these actual cases, we're able to find the better terminology, maybe even a different HS code, and then provide a richer report to your client company. But looking at this in detail before somebody starts filling out the form will be very helpful. Next, Kim, is that Excel file that I mentioned, the typical example. If you can pull that up. The one that wasn't on this, yeah. Okay, good, perfect, good, Kim. So so this is a deliverable. So you probably can't read it, but you've all received it, so you can look at it on your own computer. But basically, it has in different columns. What is the product? What is the HS code? What is the actual description on the bill of lading that came in? How many tons? what is the approximate value of the shipment? Who is the consignee, which is the importer, the target customer company that your client would like to sell to? Who was the foreign supplier, et cetera. Now you'll see not declared there. Somehow they get away sometimes not declaring. I don't know how they do that. I'm going to try and convince the Commerce Department to not allow that anymore. But so it isn't perfect. We don't get 100% of the data, but we get enough of the data to find very useful sales opportunities for the companies. So this is what the result is going to look like. The challenge for us is that if you put in a given term, we think of the word hammer. Well, there's carpenters use big hammers and small hammers, and then there's sledgehammers, and then there's forging hammers, and there's all kinds of hammers, and so that sometimes our first output has 10,000 rows of this stuff, and then the challenge for us is, as we say, to get rid of the chaff and get the grain, have a high enough percentage of grain so that when you look at it and your client company looks at it, they say, yeah, that's useful. I can see opportunities there that I didn't know about before. And then the idea is when they go to the importer, I like to say that the difference is between now, if they happen to even find that importer, in many cases they won't even know about them, but if they happen to call on them, they probably say something like, do you need any widgets next year? And the importer says, well, it was rough with China there for a couple of months, but it's looking okay now. I'll call you if I have an emergency. Now, that's not what the salesman wants to hear. Instead, the salesman comes in and says, I see you're bringing in 50 tons of widgets a year from China or India or somewhere else. And we've got this new multitasking machines, and we've done lean through our MEP, and we're so efficient now that we think our selling price is going to be within 15% of the selling price you're paying. And we've done the TCO calculation and the duty freight, carrying costs, all this other stuff. It comes out to 20%, 25%, 40% if Trump tariffs apply. So we think you, the importer, are going to be 20%, 15% better off buying from us, and you'll be able to sleep well at night, not worry about another pandemic, and you'll be helping the state and you'll be helping the country. So let's see if we can make this work out for both of us. So that's where all this is going. That's how you convince the SMEs to do it, and that's how they convince the OEM, their prospective customer, to do it. So next, column definitions file. That was another one. Kim, I'm not sure if you had it on the PDF you created or if you didn't, but basically it. I don't think you pulled it up. So I'll just describe it. It's to it takes each of the columns in that deliverable that I showed you, and it defines what each of them means, because there's just a very sort of a skimpy definition up here, and we make real clear what each of them means. So when you, like the MEP or EDO, is thinking about this, or when you're explaining it to your client and they say, what's that mean? You have the answer. So we've made it real clear, real simple for you to use. That's okay. How about we also have a Google sheet where we'll have all the New York MEP cases. So each time you send them in, and we think you're going to send them in through either CEG, TDO, or MTRC. They're going to be the gatekeepers. I think that's what we've agreed to. So whoever's out there, all 34 of you, will work through those three. The three gatekeepers will send them to us, and we'll keep track of each of the cases by New York MEP, by the gatekeeper, by the company name that you're dealing with, and the status. We'll log it in, and you'll be able to go online and check with it and see what the status is. And so we got it. We're working on it. Some idea when you're going to get it back. So that's just to keep the system rolling smoothly. Then I talked about supply chain gaps when I went through the PowerPoint, and I'm not going to take you through the equivalent pages, but for the procedure pages, for the finding the best prospect pages, for the input form, they're all very similar to what I did for ISP, just different wording, because instead of selling more of what the company now makes, they're all about helping them find something new that they could make and sell profitably, because there's a gap there and there's a crying need to fill that in the country. How about impact of using TCO, Kim? It's back in your PDF. Yep. So go up a little bit. Okay. So this is basically similar. This gets you to where we were in one of those PowerPoint forms, PowerPoint slides. So here's the raw data for those 180 cases of China versus the US. And it's very much like that blue line, or it's the same as the blue line that I showed you, but you can see the raw data here. And again, China, ex works price or FOB price as a percentage of US, then drop down, Kim. A little further down. I mean, this is just the same thing I showed you on the PDF, on the PowerPoint slide. And you can see again, the key takeaway is that 20, 30, 40% of what's now imported can be produced and sourced in the US if the companies do the math correctly. And one important point here is that if sometimes it's going to come out that, let's say the US price is up here and FOB price, and let's say the Chinese price or the Indian price is down here, and we do TCO, and maybe there's US is 40% high to start with on price, and maybe we do TCO and the US clearly wins. Well, that's great. Hopefully the company gets the order. But in some cases, it's gonna narrow the gap, but come down from US being 40% high to being 7% high, let's say. And now that's the time for the MEP or the EDO, especially the MEP, I think, to step in and say, well, let's see if we can apply lean. Let's see if we can have better skills training. Let's see if a little automation, a little redesign of the product can get that US cost down by 10%. So now the US is the clear winner on a TCO basis. And in contrast, if the US if we go back to just FOB price and the US is 40% high, and they ask the MEP, can you get 30 or 40% out of our manufacturing cost? And manufacturing costs includes not just labor, but burden and material. The odds of getting 30 or 40% is almost zero, whereas the odds of getting 7%, well, that becomes feasible. So this is now a nice opportunity to both help that company and for the MEP to have an engagement, develop some revenue, achieve its objectives for the year. So come back down to a little lower on this page, Exhibit 4. Since TCO is such an important piece of this, I've shown here a variety of studies that have been done around the world in different industries, in different countries, and what these hidden costs are the difference between the FOB price and the total cost, duty, freight, packaging, all this stuff. And consistently the studies come out in somewhere in the 15 to 25% range, which is what we also say. One of the more interesting studies was done by a professor, John Gray at Ohio State University. And what he did, he picked 4 Midwestern companies that had offshored and then reshored. He identified them and visited them, did the professorial study, and in the summary, he's got a learned article written on this. We've got a shorter article on it. But the essence was, why did you offshore in the first place? The wages and the FOB prices were so much lower, we had to do it. Well, then why did you reshore? Because after a couple of years, we found that the all the costs and risks that we ignored when we went offshore, the duty and the freight and the carrying cost of inventory and the travel costs and the risk and the midnight telephone calls and the running out of stock and having engineering in the US and manufacturing offshore. When you put all that stuff together, more or less doing total cost, when you put all that stuff together, all those other factors more than offset the price difference, which we had originally been enticed by. And so that's, in effect, they're saying just what we say. You have to look at all the costs. And so article well worth looking at. Kim, can you go to the TCO website? Okay, perfect. Kim's doing it great. Total cost of ownership estimator is we're talking about TCO, and you can see in the red sign up. So you go in there, put in I think your email address and a password, and then you can come back and sign in, little red block on the left. And then the page here describes how to use it and what it is, why, all that kind of thing. But when you go in, you'll find there's an example. So I've done a typical example, and not for you to copy, but just for you to see what's there, just for you to see what's expected, percentages or numbers or whatever it is. It helps you understand what's happening. For each, there's maybe 29 rows in there where you have to, on the inputs page, and you answer it for both the US and the offshore supplier. So you're doing a comparison between the two, and then you click a button and it takes you to the results page, and the algorithms built in like a spreadsheet, take all the inputs page information, calculate the freight cost and the duty and the carrying cost of inventory and all this other stuff that the company should be doing but don't, and come up with a total. And there's blanks at the bottom where you can put in things that we didn't quantify, like green. Some companies green's very important. And one of the best arguments for reshoring is that because the Chinese electricity production is so dirty with coal, and their factories in general are more polluting, and you've got to ship this stuff over here, that there's a significant green benefit of bringing the work back and having it done once again in New York instead of being done halfway around the world and shipped here. On this results page, there are explanations. So for each of the cells, there's an explanation. Think about an Excel spreadsheet where you have, you click on it and it tells you the formula, like B3 times the square root of A5, or something like that. So in words, in that explanation, it tells you exactly how the cost was calculated using the inputs from the prior sheet, so that if you're trying to convince in your company or at a customer company to do this, anybody who's doubting it, you can say, do you agree with the formula? Yes. Do you agree with the input numbers? Yes. Well, then you pretty much have to agree with the calculation. And so we say when you're doing TCO, to be conservative. Don't exaggerate, don't stretch the point, because if you include all of these factors, or as many of them as you can, the truth will out. The items, the products where this is an advantage will become apparent, and the advantages will be big enough in 20-30% of the cases to justify reshoring. And to put 20 or 30% in perspective, the US imports at US price level $3 trillion a year worth of products, excluding petroleum. So $3 trillion a year. So if we can bring back 20 or 30% of that, that's enough to balance the goods trade deficit and increase manufacturing by 40%, by 5 million manufacturing jobs in the United States, a proportional share of that in New York State. So we don't need to get the whole thing. We need to get 10, 20, 30% of what's being imported. And so one of the things I suggest there is to, if I'm dealing with a company like the OEM, is not to start with the average product, but to ask them about products where they have pain, Where do you have too much inventory? Where do you have quality issues? Where do you stock out occasionally and lose orders? Where do you have, and what products do you have to stay up at midnight to talk to Asia to work out issues? Where do you have too much travel? Where, if you had a couple more components made in the US, would you have a made in US product you could put a label on made in US and sell more or charge a higher price? Which things
Couple minutes,
are
Eric.
about equal and you'd like to bring it back because it would be in the interest of the state and the country to do so. I'm done. Michael?
I said, yeah, just a couple minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So we had one last thing. I know, Kim, did you have tools, the tools and resources or resources and tools page? Was that on your PDF? I'm not sure if you got it up there or not. No. Keep going down. Is that it? Keep going. Nothing else. So there's a page that you received in the file that shows in the email, and it shows links to everything, lists of everything, so that when you what is that Harry was talking about? Go to that page, tools and resources. It'll list everything and have links to almost everything, and it's just like an index or a nice place to get yourself organized. I'm done.
Great, thanks, Harry. Eric, you still there? Make sure we haven't lost you yet.
I'm here. Yep.
So we do have a few questions. First question I got, I guess the first one I think I can answer, and it relates to the materials and stuff. So does the New York MEP provide the risk assessment tools to clients at no cost and or use it as an internal tool as you provide an assessment service? So the answer to that's actually both. So most of these tools are out there, they're free to use. The MEP's role oftentimes is to train our manufacturers. So we would take these tools and help them with an assessment and get them familiar with them, so then they can continue to use them. Can they hire the MEP to help them, through that process? Yes, they can. They can totally do that. Our goal here right now is with the companies that are putting in information in through the survey, and identifying those that have a need, is to reach out to them and guide them through the process and determine, what should be the next steps. So, yeah, so that question is kind of yeah, we kind of do both. So, but the intent really as an MEP is to give the resources and tools and help train manufacturers so they can continue to do these things as part of continuous improvement and things like that. So, another question that came in also was, and it's related to this, is, what are the processes for the assessments today? Who does what, when, how, for IDing target manufacturers and contracting with them through delivery? So the critical part of this is really what's on the screen right here is going and getting manufacturers to fill out the survey. So that survey has some qualifying questions in it. And as soon as a survey comes in, I notify the MEP with that survey right away, so they can follow up and look at them. The role of the MEP at that point is to identify, is this company a potential target for any of the programs we talked about today? You don't need to necessarily take that and just run with it. If you have questions about one of those that filled it out and what might make sense, you can reach out to myself. You can reach out to Central New York TDO, Mike Metzger, Jim D'Agostino, and you can reach out to Long Island and MTRC, Amin and Cynthia. So whichever one of those MEPs is closest to you, definitely reach out to them and we can guide you and kind of help you, like, yeah, these companies make sense. Maybe these aren't because they're not really that big, they're not big enough. Or, some of them will flat out say they're not looking for assistance. So maybe we can just take those off the list right away. So So from that, once we identify them, when we identify the resource, so CEG will have a contract with Harry. So if anybody's going to be doing ISP and help with TCO, we will work with Harry on that directly. He's contracted by CEG to do that work, and those will be covered by us through this program. The other tools like the supply chain risk assessments and the vendor audit forms, those are things that you can take right away, your team directly to the client and go through them together. They're great tools to go through because you're also looking at them strategically, and you're going to learn a lot about their gaps and their needs and their pains, which then could lead to future projects with your organization. So all the projects that happen that we actually identify, assessments and projects, will actually be monitored by the regional MEP for the company in that region. And the reason for that is we need to capture those as projects in our reporting system and our survey system, obviously, for these manufacturers. They report back to the feds about that. So that's kind of the process. We're going to talk through this even more. We will continue to reach out to each regional center and have discussions about the companies that have responded to the survey. We're still kind of in that mode of getting responses from people. I think we're a little over 60 companies have responded. So I'd like to see that get up over 100. So yeah, if you have more questions about that in that process, we will be reaching out to you some more individually and talking about it, and probably talking about specific companies and what makes sense. Eric, I have a question for you. We talked a lot about vendor audit and then the supply chain risk, but how can you use those tools to maybe even analyze yourself as a vendor to a tier 1, tier 2, and OEM?
Good question. I would say, think about what you're providing, what product you can provide, and then just flip it around and use it from that perspective. What's important? I mean, a lot of the things on there are going to be universal: quality, total price, like Harry talked about. So there's a lot of things that will apply, but look at some of the things that are important when you're looking for a supplier: part tracing, quality assurance, maybe quality systems, and see if those are things that you have or need to improve to make yourself more attractive to somebody that may be looking to buy from you.
Okay, good. Harry, regarding, I think, the import substitution program, is it better to provide more details on the form rather than fewer? Does that lead to more refined results?
Let's say more accurate detail is better than fewer accurate details. Adding inaccurate details would definitely hinder the process. Whatever words the company, like for example, the most, maybe the biggest challenge is, what words does the company use to describe their product? What does the industry use? If the company uses one term and the industry has another, maybe the international industry, even in English, has a different word for it, put all those words down, but don't go to words that are irrelevant. Let's say if it's really hard to describe, then it might be good to put in maybe a link to the company's website that shows the product, and then we can take a look at it, or they could include a picture of the product that they're really good at making. So our people, when we're doing the search, the better we can understand what it is, the faster we're going to home in on an accurate solution for the client. So a lot of accurate data, no inaccurate data.
Right. So yeah. So try not to be overly wordy and just get more to the point, right?
Stay to the point, but if there's 5 good words that different people use to describe the product, put all 5 of them in. If you know 10 big domestic companies that you like to sell to, or maybe do sell to, and you think are at the import level in the supply chain, put them all in. The more the merrier there.
Right. And kind of related to that same question, and it's about more the the difference in like mold and molding that you said. Is it is it better to do a description or just stick to keywords?
Mainly keywords.
Okay.
If you want to put in, if you think that the word isn't known well by other people, then maybe a keyword and then a parentheses that gives a 5-word or 10-word description of it.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, then, like you often said, I know I've been on HS codes in the past too, and they tend to be very specific and sometimes be a little generic. And I know you have an option to put in that word, but then a more defining words next to it. Like you mentioned, screws and bolts and whatever might fall into fasteners. But it does come with spending the time to really think it through, right?
It's important. The HS code is the simplest way. If we really have the right HS code, everything gets easier. Because a word is a word, whereas a number is is specific kind of thing. Yeah. So if you can get the right HS code, it certainly helps a lot.
Right. Yeah. And I've talked to Harry about this several times, and that I think the key thing to get the client over is getting them to think about what they build and what they build good. What is the actual product they're delivering to their client versus I have these capabilities.
Yeah, and for example, so think I know machine shops best, and if you ask them what do you make well, they say anything as big as a bread box. Like, could you be more specific? No, we do anything that comes in the door if it's that size and it's made out of metal. Well, they're probably not the best candidate. Whereas if they say, cylindrical parts, typically shafts, up to 3 feet long, out of steel for the utility industry. Well, now we're getting somewhere. We've got a much better chance of finding imports that they'll be competitive making.
Kate asked this question, and I probably have the answer to it. So they're asking about, I think, the survey, and it says, can you start the data entry and log back in to complete it at a later time if we don't get it all in there at once? The survey really should only take about 10 minutes if you're talking to the right person or have the right people in the room, or if you're at the right level in the company. To fill it out. So there's a lot of people that have gone to it but haven't finished it. You have to go through the survey to its entirety to get to the submit button at the very end. I don't know if it remembers the actual information, and you can go back to it. There are cookies associated with it, but I do think the survey needs you to complete it all the way. So Carol EMT asked, do we contract with CEG for audits that use the tools Eric described and do not include Harry? Oh, so so the tools that Harry or that Eric shared are tools that you can use. You don't need to contract with CEG to do them. However, we do want to know that you complete them. As I said, in those instances, a select number of those that get completed, we will actually have funds available to go to the MEP Center and our partners for completing them. But there is a limited amount of money that's available in each region. But you can still continue to complete them even without that. But so you don't need Harry for that. For anything related to TCO, the import substitution program, etc., that what we would do there is CEG will have a contract with Harry. You will treat Harry like he's like a third party to you, but he's going to come in and you're going to collect the information. He's going to do the report and get that off to you. But ultimately, in the end, I'm paying.
Thank you, Michael. Let me make one comment there. Again, the TCO estimator, TCO estimator is free to use online. Yeah. Anybody can use it. So knock yourself out, use it. help 100 companies. You don't need to call me, anybody, unless you need help. You need help, call me. Okay.
We're almost done here. Harry, how difficult has it been to get finance and accounting managers to accept TCO determined product acquisition values?
It's in some companies, let's say it's always difficult because most of them know of the term and they should have done it years ago. But especially the supply chain people, the procurement people are typically rewarded on how much money they save on an FOB price basis. Their bonus, their pay, their promotion depends on finding the cheapest place to buy the product. And I've had, and it can be hard to convince them. I know salesmen who've gone in and said, why do I have to meet the Chinese price when you're having warranty issues and you can't get delivery? Because I buy at the lowest price. So in that case, sometimes you have to go around the roadblock and go to the other elements in the company, to the quality people, to the inventory control people, to engineering, to manufacturing, to the general manager, and say, hey, the procurement person is insisting on price, and you've got problems, and we can solve those problems, and you're going to save money. Can we work this out? And so in some cases, the general manager will order the procurement people to look at all the costs instead of just the price. So it's not, if it were simple, it would have been done. You wouldn't need me.
So this is kind of a follow-up question too. So the import substitution program. So obviously you create an account, you log in. Is that a login that's just specific to one import substitution program assessment, or can like an MEP go in and have multiple companies there?
Are you talking about the input form, or are you talking about like this Google Sheet thing I talked about?
Import form.
The input form is specific to one client company, and you fill that out, you download it, you have them fill it out with your help, and then you I think you then email it to one of the 3 MEP gatekeepers, okay, and then the gatekeeper sends it into Sandy, who's on my team, and Harry, and we process it.
Okay, good. Yeah, so because what ultimately happens is once they register, they get access to that form. They can download it, they can fill it out, and then get it to us. We can review it to make sure there's nothing that stands
reasonable
out.
Yeah,
get to you, and then that now they have access to it, and they can refill that form out for multiple companies if they need to.
Yeah, the form is, anybody can download it now. You don't need to log in or anything. Just download it and use it. In terms of the TCO, as I mentioned, there's a free online webinar. It's on that resources and tool sheet that everybody received. There's a link to it, and it's free to do the training. But also, I suggest that a month or 2 from now, whenever enough people have tried it, that when people use the TCO form, they write down questions. This could be the clients, it could be the MEP people, and we have a session where everybody asks their questions and I answer the questions, so everybody benefits from everybody else's experience. So at any time when you want to do something like that, I'd be happy to do it.
Great. So MEPs and organizations that are out there that either helped a company fill out the survey, or has received a forward from me showing a company that's filled out a survey. If you've identified some that you think would be good targets for moving forward with an assessment of some sort, reach out to me, reach out to TDO or MTRC, and we'll talk about them and look at what makes the most sense and what the next step really should be. So with that, I don't see any other questions. So Eric, Harry, Thank you, Kim. Thank you.
I say participants, thank you for staying with us for almost 2 hours. Yeah.
All this information will be, we'll either email it to you, but what we're thinking we're going to do is we're going to put a resource page together that has all the links. That's going to be in one place, so you can always go back to that with all of our contact information as well. So be looking for that, as well as a recording of this coming soon. Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye, Michael. Thank you.